Ms. Collier scientifically explains.
Lab safety.
Let's talk about safety in the science lab. The first time you use the lab, you're going to have to sign a safety contract. This is so that we know that you promise to remain very safe inside the labs. You will be given this long list of rules that you need to follow, but we're going to go over some of the key ones now. Number 1, you're not allowed inside the lab unless a teacher has invited you to come in. You should always pay strict instructions to whatever their teacher is asking you to do and do it promptly and directly and exactly as you've been instructed. This will help you to remain safe. When you're using the labs, you must think of the safety of yourself and of everyone else in the room. There should be no running or silly behavior happening in the labs. You may not eat or drink anything in the labs. You can bring in a water bottle to use during class, but we do not consume any food or drinks. This includes if we do a science experiment that includes food. Sometimes we might melt some chocolate and it might be tempting to take a little taste of that. But because we're using scientific equipment, those beakers and other equipment that we use for our science experiment could have been used to house very dangerous chemicals by a different class in the period before us. So we must make sure that we're not eating or drinking anything that comes into the lab. When you get up from your work benches to come to your experiment benches, make sure you're tucking in your chairs so that we're keeping the floor very clear and everyone has direct paths to where they need to go. Before you start an experiment, make sure you check all your equipment to notice if there's any breakage or damage and alert your teacher to that immediately. Remember, you're not going to get in trouble if a piece of equipment is damaged unless you broke it on purpose, but we want to know that it is in top working condition before we start an experiment, because otherwise it might be dangerous to use damaged equipment in our experiments. When you are setting up experiments, make sure you set them up in the middle of the bench and that they're not hanging on the edge of the bench that could potentially mean that they fall or get knocked over easily. When you have a test tube, never point this end at another person or at your own face. Sometimes, especially if we're using different chemicals, it can be creating gases that we can't see that could actually damage our face or our senses. So we never look straight down into a beaker or a test tube. If we want to know what's happening, they're glass, so we just look in the side. If you're ever using a Bunsen burner, it's going to have flames coming over it. Never reach across the flame. Even if you think the flame is only this big and you're going to reach across over here, flames are actually a lot larger and the heat from them actually travels a lot higher than you can anticipate. So never reach across a Bunsen burner. If we're trying to heat up a liquid, we should never heat it in a closed container. When we are heating things, we should never leave the hot instruments around that someone else might accidentally come in and pick up, not knowing that they are hot. So we must make sure we put them away or cool them down before leaving them alone. Whenever we are finished an experiment, we should be clearing away our whole bench, wiping it down, and then going to the sinks to wash our hands. A pretty obvious one is that we should never be tasting chemicals. Remember, we don't eat or drink anything in the lab. Another thing we also don't do is sniff anything in science. So if there was some chemicals and things inside my test tube or my beaker and I want to observe, which is what we do a lot in science, what it smells like, I'm not going to put my nose near it and sniff. This is because just like looking down it, there can be some chemicals or things like that that are happening that could really hurt me. So instead we use the wafting process. So that means we hold up our beaker or our test tube and we slowly waft the air towards our face, where then we can sniff. It'll be a bit less diluted and it won't hit us right in the face. So this is called wafting. If a chemical or anything else ever spills or breaks, alert your teacher immediately. Never mix chemicals or do anything else that your teacher hasn't directly told you to do. Let's talk about protective equipment. First of all, you always need to have protective footwear on. This means your leather school shoes are probably going to be a really good fit. Whenever you're doing an experiment with chemicals or anything like that, you need to wear your safety glasses to protect your eyes. And then we have our protective clothing. We must use our lab coats anytime we are using chemicals, but you can use your lab coats anytime you're doing an experiment. We must really think about if we need to use gloves, either latex or heat-proof gloves, when we are doing an experiment if we can't have the things or heat touch our hands. Next it says long hair must be tied back. Oops. That means ladies and gentlemen, your hair should be short, but ladies, you need to have your hair tied back. That also means you can't have little bits that are hanging out that could accidentally get burnt off or anything like that during an experiment. Make sure your hair is done up nice and tight away from your face. If you have really long hair, you might even consider what you're going to do with your ponytail, because if you're leaning over an experiment, it could get into the way. If you have any loose clothing or anything that's hanging down out or any jewelry, which you shouldn't have, you need to remove those for experiments as well. Let's think about electrical safety. If you have any extension cords or electrical cords, or you have to plug something in, it shouldn't be done over a walkway. We should never make people accidentally trip into an electrical cord. We should never let cords or any other ropes hang over the edge of workbenches, because they could get caught and cause anything to fall. When you're going to plug something into a power point, make sure the power is turned off before you plug it in. Once you're ready, then you can turn the power on. When you're finished, make sure to unplug and turn the electricity off. Eye safety. As we said, we're going to wear our goggles when we're doing anything with an experiment that could hurt our eyes. Another good tip is never look directly into the sun, but I'm pretty sure you know that one already. It's always a good idea to avoid wearing contact lenses in the lab, so if you can wear your glasses, it's always safer. And if any substance ever gets in your eye, tell your teacher and use the eye bath as soon as possible. Remember that you need to wash out those eyes for about 15 minutes. Glassware. Now remember what I said, every time you're going to use any piece of glass, make sure you check that there's no cracks or cuts in it that could cause it to break during your experiment. If there is, just tell your teacher. And obviously, if something breaks, do not pick up the glass yourself, but alert your teacher and help to make sure that all your friends are standing back and not going anywhere near the glass. Waste disposal. Remember we talked about the glass bins, the fire bin for putting any matches in, and the spills bin. Remember, whenever you're going to throw something away, check with your teacher to see which bin you should be putting it into, and making sure we're cleaning up our mess after ourselves. So those are all the main rules of our science lab. I know it can seem like a lot, but all of them are there to keep you safe while we're doing experiments. Once you agree that you will behave in that way in the science lab, which is not very hard and it does keep you safe, then you can sign the science contract. One goes to you and one comes to the school. And this is just to remind you and for us to know that you promise to stay safe in the labs.